Okay, we're going to talk about high carb foods proven to reverse insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So, in the world of diabetes and maybe even weight loss and just health in general, carbs are the devil. And we're going to talk about why that's not the case and a lot of the science that backs up this perspective. So, if you ask somebody living with any form of diabetes, living with insulin resistance, looking to lose weight, hey, these are some foods to eat, they'd be like, well, I can't have very much of those, if any at all. Like bananas spike me, baked potatoes spike me, brown rice. If I have that, I just have to have a tiny amount. What we're going to talk about today is how these are actually the foods that are best to embrace in abundant quantities. You want to increase your insulin sensitivity through consuming these foods. So when I was in middle school, I had a teacher that it was an English teacher, and she would read the last chapter of a book and then go back to the beginning and read the rest. And I'm going to tell you the conclusion here, and then we're going to go through a lot of science to understand, how we come to this. But the best way to optimize insulin sensitivity is to consume a diet of whole foods, okay? So whole carbohydrates, where your macronutrient ratio is a minimum of 70% of calories coming from carbohydrates and a maximum of 15% coming from protein and a maximum of 15 coming from fat. So it's not that you're trying to hit this like exact caloric nutrient ratio. It's this range. And it's amazing how whole plant foods, which you've heard all about from many other experts so far, how they simply fall into this ratio automatically without you even having to try very hard. And I know this is quite the opposite of what most people with diabetes have been told to do, what a lot of people living with right now, they struggle. They test their blood glucose after eating a bunch of carbs and they see a high number and they're like, well, carbohydrates are the problem. But we're going to discuss why that's actually not the case.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Excellent. All right. So we're going to cover my experience living with type 1 diabetes. We're going to talk about what the heck insulin resistance actually is. And we're going to cover the history of reversing insulin resistance, which is absolutely fascinating. I have a strong passion for this history. We're going to talk about how this science can apply to today. And we're going to go over exactly what to eat for optimal insulin sensitivity. And you'll understand why that is so important. So I've been living with type 1 diabetes for 24 years now. I was diagnosed on January 26th of 2000. I essentially self-diagnosed myself. My older brother was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 9 years prior to me. So I was quite familiar with the condition. I knew the symptoms to look for. And I was going to the bathroom all the time. I was thirsty all the time. And I said, Mom, I'm pretty sure I have diabetes. She said, no, don't be silly. You don't have diabetes. I said, okay. So we were living in Minnesota at the time, and she and my dad were in Florida looking for homes because we were going to be moving to Florida. And she called to check in and she said, how are things going? I said, Mom, I couldn't sleep last night. I was cramping the whole time. She said, okay, go upstairs, use your brother's blood glucose meter and test yourself. And I was well over 400. That's 4 times what a normal blood glucose level should be. And as an active, young, supposedly healthy 12-year-old kid, should not have a blood glucose anywhere near 400. So my brother said right then and there, yeah, you have type 1 diabetes. Pack your bag. You're going to be in the hospital for a few nights. So we went to the general doctor and they ran a few tests. And then they sent me to the hospital and put me on an IV drip and gave me insulin. My parents flew back the next day. And I remember my dad just saying, this is just an inconvenience. It's just an inconvenience in your life and you can still do whatever you want. And that's sort of how they raised me and my brother. And we would go and get care at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And while I was seeing doctors at the, one of the most prestigious medical establishments in the country, in the world, nobody ever said anything to me about paying attention to insulin sensitivity or talking about what I could do to reverse insulin resistance or optimize my insulin use. They were teaching me to just follow a typical food pyramid, a standard American diet. Their goal was to try and make me feel as normal as possible. So as a 12-year-old in middle school, they just wanted me to be able to eat what my friends were eating and learn how to inject the insulin. And in hindsight, this is a big missed opportunity. When somebody's diagnosed with a condition like this is a great opportunity to encourage people to optimize their health and become more disciplined in their healthy lifestyle choices. So I just followed the standard American diet, and I did that for many years, and I ended up with a lot of health issues. I had cystic acne, which was really frustrating as a teenager. I mean, my mom would take me to the dermatologist. We would try all the treatments, different pills, different creams. They did these like laser treatments, microdermabrasion treatments. Eventually, they put me on Accutane, which is basically the most advanced drug you can use for acne. And my mom had to sign a waiver because some people had committed suicide on that drug. So it was kind of like a last ditch resort right there. And it did work a little bit, but wasn't happy to be using that drug. I also had allergies year round. Like I would get sick all the time. I'd take my Nasonex, I'd take my Claritin D, I would still get sick. And as a competitive tennis player, I experienced frustrating plantar fasciitis, which was not really good as a tennis player. The pain in the arches of my feet was brutal. I remember going to a foot doctor, and he had proposed this treatment where they literally break, like they do like this shock therapy, and it breaks both of your legs. And that is supposed to help with the plantar fasciitis problem. And he told me a story about some very successful high school athlete that had done that. And I was just like, wow, that's crazy. And my plantar fasciitis has completely gone away, changing lifestyle. So it's amazing all the various treatments out there. But before I ended up getting to a plant-based diet, I tried other things. I tried a Weston A. Price Foundation diet. I remember sending an email to Sally Fallon, asking her a couple questions. I didn't see any change in my diabetes health when I was doing this. It was certainly steps forward of getting away from a standard American diet, that was for sure. And then I switched to a ketogenic plant-based diet. I learned about this from Gabriel Cousens, another amazing health advocate. And I've always been on this path to do whatever it takes to fully reverse type 1 diabetes naturally. That's my mission. That's how I've gotten to all this information I'm going to share with you today. Just continue on that mission. I have not reversed type 1 diabetes yet. I haven't figured that out yet, but that's sort of where I came from. And that's how I got into a lot of the Gabriel Cousens information and this like raw foods and plant-based diets and keto and low carb and all this stuff. The problem on this approach for me and many others was I just didn't have any energy. I was a freshman at the University of Florida when I was following this, and my favorite thing to do was to play pickup basketball. And I just didn't have any energy. Like it was really, really a low point. I was quite miserable. I put in a lot of effort into making lifestyle changes. My dad and I had flown from Florida to California to go see a very unique medicine man who was doing all kinds of crazy Chinese herbs. And I was taking pills and having this crazy tea with like a bunch of barks and stuff. Like the teas smelled terrible. I would cook up this tea literally outside my dorm room. I was outside my dorm room because it smelled so bad. I would have like this portable pot and portable heater thing and go and sit outside, plug it into an outlet and make my tea. I was just doing all kinds of things. But it's been a blessing that it's finally led me to something that has worked, not just for me, but for a lot of others. So I heard a podcast it was around like September 2006. I heard a podcast with this guy, Dr. Doug Graham, and he was talking about how he helped people eat a lot of fruit. And somewhere in the podcast, he was mentioning how it can help cleanse people of, the body does the cleansing when you get the proper nutrients and the proper energy source. So I was very intrigued by this because being a student at the University of Florida and being very lost and confused with what the heck to do next after all these years of trying different things and trying to optimize my health and, reduce my insulin use and all this stuff, I ended up getting convinced to go back to a naturopathic doctor who was giving me a lot of supplements. She would do what's called electrodermal screening test. And she would take a machine and she would put the pricker on my machine. And then she would do that for every single food, like over and over and over again. It was some electrical match to like, oh, can I have this food? Can I not have this food? So I had been doing that for a while. And she's giving this long printout of foods to eat and foods not to eat. You can eat apples. You can't eat bananas. You can eat pork, but you can't eat chicken, stuff like that. And I went back to her. I was like, okay, well, I mean, what's next? And her suggestion was to try some like IV therapy, some chelation therapy. And so that was in Tampa. So I'd have to drive from Gainesville to Tampa to do this. And I was really considering it. I was like, oh, maybe I'll try it. Like, I'm willing to do anything. I really am. I still am to this day. And I heard this podcast before I had committed to doing that chelation therapy. And I was like, well, this guy's proclaiming that if I put the right foods in my body, that the intelligence of my human body will basically start eliminating things that just don't belong there. So that was the path that I went down. And I went from a ketogenic diet where I couldn't, carrots had too many carbs, right? Bell peppers, too many carbs. I certainly wasn't having figs and mangoes and peaches and oranges like you see on the screen here. So it was a huge transformation as I went from that keto approach to now a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet. My energy came back very quickly. I had so much fun. This is the picture of me in college in Gainesville, harvesting persimmons off of some trees, just really having a good time. And I got amazing bananas on that plate. I got figs. There's blueberries, strawberries. I just started eating all these amazing, this whole world of the different varieties of plants, different varieties of fruits, different varieties of greens. It was incredible. So I had a lot of fun. I've been doing this now for 18 years. And the amazing thing that happened here, which is, why I think type 1 diabetes has been a great blessing in my life, is it's really led me on this path, this mission to reverse type 1 diabetes and support others. But the very fact that I must inject insulin at mealtime is the blessing, right? I have insight into what lifestyle choices make insulin work efficiently or less efficiently because my body doesn't produce any. So I have insights that 99.9% of the world's population does not have. So I can clearly and easily compare how is insulin working when I'm doing a keto plant-based diet versus a low-fat plant-based whole food diet. How much total carbohydrate am I consuming? How much insulin do I need, right? So you can see here on the screen, this is a big change. And it would be even larger if you look at it with just glucose. So this is total carbohydrate here. But if you take out fiber and you take out fructose, which you can do now with these modern nutrition softwares, I use Chronometer, you can literally see exactly how much glucose are you consuming on any given meal, on any given day. And I know exactly how much insulin I need to metabolize specifically the glucose, because fiber is processed independent of insulin, and so is fructose. So you want to take that out when you're consuming a lot of fruit for a really accurate reading. And my insulin sensitivity is just bonkers compared to most people. In our book, we wrote about a study where there was a low carb group and they were following more like a Dr. Bernstein style diet, right? Very, very low carbohydrate, no fruit is allowed. And these were type 1s. On average, they were consuming 30 grams of carbohydrate per day and using 30 units of insulin. I will now consume over 700 grams of carbohydrate per day and inject under 30, more like 26, 27. It depends on the activity that day. But the magnitude of change in insulin sensitivity is what has just lit me up about this topic and led me to go read a lot of the research we're going to talk about today and get excited about helping other people with this information. So here I am 18 years later, following this low-fat plant-based whole food diet. My current A1C right now is 5.5%. As a person living with type 1 diabetes, the range we're looking for in our blood glucose meter is somewhere between 70 and 180. And we'll talk about that later on with more insights into what time in range is, why that's so important, why it's actually a better indicator of your blood glucose control than A1C. I'm consistently active. I have predictable blood glucose readings, which is really important. So not only is that time in range 90% really strong for type 1 diabetes, but my blood glucose variability is very strong as well. So the standard deviation of what's happening as far as my blood glucose going up and down is steady, and that's what we want. So that's how you get predictable blood glucose readings, so you're not on a roller coaster. I don't use any pharmaceutical medications other than insulin. So I'm not having to take any acne medications. I'm not using any allergy medications. My plantar fasciitis is gone, and my skin has cleared up. So I'm really happy with the results. This is me in 2023. I did 3 Ironman races. This was me crossing the finish line in Tulsa. So an Ironman race is where you swim 2.4 miles, then you bike 112, and then you run a marathon, 26.2. And this particular race took me 11 hours, 46 minutes, and 9 seconds. And I really enjoy this sport. I actually have another race coming up here in just 9 days in Houston. So I'm looking forward to that. Let's talk a little bit about how the types of diabetes are united. So there's a lot of different types of diabetes. Type 1.5, a lot of people are just learning about, also known as LADA, latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. And that's basically a slow onset version of type 1. Type 1 is what I'm living with. My insulin, or my pancreas doesn't produce any insulin. I have diabetes antibodies that supposedly have destroyed beta cells. So it's classified as an autoimmune condition. And I have to inject insulin to eat food. And that's typically what happens with type 1.5 diabetes. Prediabetes, we have a lot of people living with prediabetes. A lot of people don't even know they have prediabetes. Type 2 is the most common. Over 90% of all people diagnosed with diabetes have type 2. Gestational diabetes happens during pregnancy. But the key thing for this presentation is that insulin resistance can be present in all forms. So prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes, insulin resistance is the cause. Like, it's a precursor. You cannot have any of those 3 conditions unless you have some advanced form of insulin resistance. Now, type 1, type 1.5, those are autoimmune conditions. You can have those conditions and be insulin resistant. We call that double diabetes, all right? And so when we talk about becoming insulin sensitive and reversing insulin resistance, this is applicable to all forms of diabetes, and quite frankly, a lot of people beyond diabetes. So upwards of 45% of the population is insulin resistant. So the key thing here also is that insulin resistance can be thought of as a central node to a laundry list of chronic diseases. This is just a few of them. So the number 1 cause of death for people living with all forms of diabetes is heart disease, okay? If you're insulin resistant, you have an increased risk of developing everything you see on the screen: cancer, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, fatty liver disease, that's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, chronic kidney disease, Alzheimer's disease, neuropathy, erectile dysfunction, blindness, retinopathy, PCOS, obesity, insulin resistance. If you can become insulin sensitive, you are addressing all of these things simultaneously and really putting yourself in prevention mode. And in many of the cases, being able to reverse some of these conditions listed on the screen. So what is insulin resistance? Here's the actual dictionary definition. It is the diminished ability of cells to respond to the action of insulin in transporting glucose from the bloodstream into muscle and other tissues. So in short, what's happening is your body is struggling to do the process of moving glucose from your bloodstream into your cells. And so you end up with elevated blood glucose levels, right? And initially what's happening is, in a lot of people who are insulin resistant that don't know it, those are the people who have healthy A1C numbers. If they checked their blood glucose, they would see that their blood glucose is fine, but they're producing excess insulin to maintain those healthy blood glucose levels. And that's where something like a fasting insulin test can become really insightful. And you want to be working with, qualified medical professionals to be able to interpret that information. But a lot of people are living with insulin resistance that don't even know it. They don't have the signs yet. All right. So this information really does apply to the bulk of our population. So the primary cause of insulin resistance is the excess consumption of dietary fat. Fat blocks insulin from working properly. It blocks insulin from doing its function to signal those tissues to open up and accept glucose. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cover the history of this topic. And this is where it gets fascinating. Like, strap your seatbelts. It is mind-boggling that this information has not been shared and isn't easily understood. by the population, and we can discuss some of that later on and some of the reasons of why. I don't really know, but this is information that's been clearly documented and demonstrated since insulin was discovered, which is absolutely fascinating. So insulin was first discovered in 1921, and then in 1922 is when it was first injected into a human being, right? So insulin, it's a hormone. It's a necessary required hormone. Everybody here, we all produce it, or for me, I inject it. But we didn't know what it was. We couldn't know what was going on in that case until 1921. And then once they figured it out, okay, well, now they could treat people in 1922. And as early as 1926, Dr. Sansom saw that by feeding his patients bread, potatoes, low-fat milk, and fruit, he could improve their insulin sensitivity. So this is not a low-fat diet. We're going to go into detail about what a truly low-fat diet is. I showed you on the initials that it's no more than 15% of calories from fat. We'll get into that. But this was a very early study published in JAMA, one of the most prestigious journals. And he used, in his own words, he said it was a radical experiment. It was a radical experiment with 150 patients. And when he increased their carbohydrate intake significantly, insulin requirements remained the same. They didn't need more insulin, right? So this is an improvement in their ability to metabolize glucose, right? They became more insulin sensitive. And more importantly, is that, again, as early as 1926, we started to see that the bigger picture of what an improved level of insulin sensitivity means for somebody's overall health. So prior to the discovery of insulin, diabetes was essentially a death sentence. I mean, people were really, really struggling. They were just trying to keep it as low carb as possible to basically stay alive. And then once they could finally, use insulin, they started to learn a lot. And these folks returned to normal physical and mental activity. They didn't have a hard time managing their blood glucose levels. They improved their cardiovascular health. The diet was more palatable than previous diets that they were trying to use to treat diabetes. They had reduced cravings for forbidden foods, and the diet was cheaper. So they saw a number of benefits. In 1935, Dr. Rabinovich publishes a paper called The Effects of the High-Carbohydrate, Low-Calorie Diet Upon Carbohydrate Tolerance in Diabetes. Now, he says low calorie in this title, but it actually was isocaloric. So he didn't decrease calories, didn't increase them, he kept them constant, right? So it wasn't some like 600 calorie diet or some 800 calorie diet, which a lot of people are using. That's not what this was. All right. So he fed people a very consistent diet. He had a very solid mechanism for teaching people how much to eat and what to eat. And it was very systematic. So this is kind of an example, an overview of what they'd eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the key thing here is it was a significant increase in carbohydrate compared to the low-carb diet, right? So bacon, fatty meats, and fish and cream were all forbidden. And in this case, he had 24% of calories coming from fat. Still not as low as we want it to be, still not as low as modern science has shown leads to greater insulin sensitivity, but some remarkable results for the early days here. So on the old diet, this is after 5 years, the average insulin use in the low-carb group, higher in fat, it only dropped by about 1%, okay? Saw a 1% reduction. Whereas on this new diet, 57% reduction in insulin use. Okay, that's a dramatic change in insulin sensitivity here. So he concluded this paper showing or demonstrating that there's a lot of benefits here. Patients feel and look well. They have more energy, all right? They adhere to the diet better. This is applied to all forms of diabetes. They had a significant decrease in the incidence of diabetic coma. They improved their cardiovascular health. It simplified their diabetes management. And at the time, tuberculosis was the thing, so they had a low tuberculosis rate, which was great. And this quote, it really says it all. It really does. This is just in 1935, we've known this. And somehow this information has gotten lost. Suffice it to say that now appears to be fairly well established that carbohydrates improve, whereas fats impair carbohydrate tolerance. And that carbohydrates increase, whereas fats decrease the sensitivity of the individual, animal, and man to insulin. All right? We saw this in 1935. Dr. Himsworth was the man who was actually credited with discovering the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. These are legendary researchers here. And he published a paper in 1935, which was quite fascinating. This is a insulin depression curve. So they're actually not allowed to do this anymore. It's not really safe. This is some sort of old school science. But what you're seeing on the screen is one individual who was tested. There was a sort of a washout period. This was 7 different diets that were consumed over several weeks, and there was a washout period, then they would do it again. This is a very thorough, very rigorous study here. And what you see is there's 7 different diets. So I'm going to zoom in a second here, but on the left, on the upper left corner, that's 80% of calories coming from fat. Then on the bottom right, 13% of calories coming from fat. So we're sort of in that magical number of under 15%, right? So that's a truly low-fat diet there. And the difference is striking. And I'm actually going to go back. Let me explain this. I'm going to go back to the other slide for a second. So what you're seeing is an insulin depression curve. So in the way upper left, you see the arrow that says insulin 3 units at 0 minutes. So it was injected at 0 minutes. Then you're seeing the blood glucose level, 100, 80, 90, 80, and 70, right? So you're seeing that insulin didn't start lowering this person's blood glucose level until about, call it like 6 minutes or so, right? And then when the insulin did start working and started lowering the blood glucose level, it maybe went to about 85 or so, okay? That was on the high-fat diet. Then on the far right, now you're looking at the low-fat diet. Insulin started to work faster. The insulin maybe started working around 2 minutes, 3 minutes there. It started to lower the patient's blood glucose levels. And when it did start working, it drew the blood glucose below 70. So that larger shaded region is a reflection of insulin sensitivity. Insulin began working faster, and it drove the blood glucose lower. Okay, so if we go back and look at the overall picture here, as the diet becomes lower and lower in total, fat intake, right? So we're getting low fat, like more and more reduced fat here, right? You see that shaded region is getting larger and larger. It's a stepwise increase in insulin sensitivity. And that's what was fascinating here. And he concluded this paper by saying, it is demonstrated that the efficiency with which a standard dose of crystalline insulin acts on the blood sugar is determined by the carbohydrate content of the diet. So that the greater the amount of carbohydrate in the diet, the greater the sensitivity of the organism to insulin, right? I mean, this is very clear. It's the exact opposite of what we've been told today. And we're going to see as this continues that this is happening decade after decade, okay? Decade after decade. So 1939, Dr. Walter Kempner, he feeds his patients the rice fruit diet, all right? You may have heard about this. This is kind of a pretty popular diet here. And I'm going to go back here. So this diet was white rice. It was fruit juice, a little bit of whole fruits, and then white table sugar. And the goal here was for it to be extremely low in fat. 5 grams of fat on a 2,400 calorie diet. I mean, it's crazy. 2%. We're not recommending this, but the science, the demonstration here of insulin sensitivity is significant and also just improved health. So he saw great results when it came to helping people with kidney disease, massive obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, arthritis, heart disease, heart failure, psoriasis, retinopathy. But even he was a little bit skeptical about what would happen with diabetes. So he published a paper with 100 consecutive patients. 100 consecutive patients. There was no cherry picking here. And he wanted to show what would happen with diabetes patients. So this is what happened on average. This is published in 1958. The fasting blood glucose levels of these 100 patients went from 202 to 155. It went down. Total insulin use went down. Cholesterol from 297 to 239. You see these numbers on the screen. We don't need to go through every one. The bottom line is it was improvements across the board. You would expect the opposite. Right? If you had read Hemsworth research and Rabinowitz and Sansom and some others, maybe you wouldn't expect the opposite. But in today's world, with what's being said about diabetes and how to manage diabetes and reverse insulin resistance, you would expect that when somebody is fed white rice, so processed, fruit juice, and table sugar, that their fasting blood glucose levels should go up, their insulin use should probably go up, but the exact opposite occurred. Okay, so this was a good one. In 1955, Inder Singh published a paper in The Lancet, and he had 80 subjects. They were all using somewhere between 20 and 120 units of insulin per day. And when he fed them this diet, this was, again, a truly low-fat diet, 13% of calories coming from fat. And in just 18 weeks, 80% of the study participants stopped using insulin completely. And the 6 patients that were initially using 80 to 120 units dropped to 20 to 40 units of insulin per day. And the 6 patients required less than 10 units of insulin per day. So across the board, every single person saw improvements in insulin sensitivity, with 80% just stopping insulin use, just truly reversing insulin resistance. And he concludes the paper saying there's no indication that healthy people taking a diet high in carbohydrates are especially liable to diabetes. In fact, numerous observations show improvement of carbohydrate tolerance following its greater intake. This is another good one. New England Journal of Medicine, 1971, Dr. Brunzell. All right. This paper, he had 22 subjects. There were 13 people with mild diabetes. You could essentially call that pre-diabetes. And he fed these subjects a weight-maintaining control diet for 8 to 10 days. It's 40% of calories from fat. And then he fed them a weight-maintaining low-fat diet for 10 days. And this diet was 0% calories from fat. The only way to achieve that is to feed people a really processed diet, because all whole foods contain fat. Even bananas and potatoes and rice and lettuce and arugula, everything, all whole foods contain some amount of fat. And actually, they contain essential fatty acids as well. And you can actually meet your requirements just by consuming enough calories of a wide range of foods. Although we recommend some ground up flax seeds and chia seeds for as an insurance policy. But nonetheless, the 0% calories from fat test here had to be processed food. That's how do you accomplish that? So it was a sugar water diet with some protein powder thrown in, right? So dextrose with some protein powder. And this is what happened. Across the board, fasting blood glucose values decreased. All subjects, right? So the people who didn't have diabetes saw an 8% reduction, and those who were living with essentially pre-diabetes saw a 9.6% reduction in their fasting blood glucose values on the sugar water diet compared to the standard diet, 40% of calories from fat. And you can see they did a paired oral glucose tolerance test here. And as you can see on the left, the high carbohydrate diet, this is the blood glucose levels on the paired oral glucose tolerance. This is where you consume 75 grams of glucose, right? That's what you do and then every 30 minutes, they're plotting what is the blood glucose level of this group and what is the insulin level, okay? So the high carbohydrate group, that's the dotted line that's the lower line here across the board, right? So blood glucose values were lower, insulin levels were lower, essentially across the board on this sugar water diet. And here's how he concludes the paper. How then is the paradox of improved glucose tolerance with unchanged insulin response explained? These data suggest that the high carbohydrate diet increased the sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin. 1979, James W. Anderson, he published a number of studies. He was working on a high fiber diet. That's what he would talk about a lot in his studies. So this is where he had 20 lean men. They were all living with diabetes and they were using insulin. They all had a fasting blood glucose above 200. And he had them on a weight-maintaining control diet for 7 days and a weight-maintaining low-fat diet for 16 days. Again, this is another one where the fat content is about where we want it, 9%, under 15%. And the key thing here is weight maintaining, because a lot of skeptics will say, oh, well, if you lose weight, then that's really what's happening here, right? And that's a long-standing debate amongst the two different camps. But in this case, it was a weight-maintaining diet. And In just, let's see here. This was 16 days. In 16 days, all the red arrows are people who dropped to 0 units of insulin on a weight-maintaining low-fat diet. So at the top, patient number 1 was using 15 units of insulin, and in 18 days, they dropped to 0. And then patient 16 there at the bottom, they were using 32 units of insulin and dropped down to 0, okay? That's a profound change in insulin sensitivity. High carbohydrate, high fiber, low fat. That was the results there. So 10 of the 20 people stopped using insulin completely. Everyone reduced their insulin requirements. There was not a single subject in the study that did not reduce their insulin requirements. Their fasting and post-meal blood glucose levels lowered, and their cholesterol dropped as well. That's what happened in 16 days. 1991, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Dr. Shintani published a paper about feeding obese people in Hawaii their traditional diet. That's what he did here. There were 19 participants. They were all obese. And this was a very well-controlled diet where the subject would go to a center and they would pick up their food, and what they didn't eat, they would bring back. So everything was really, really measured. It was very dialed in. And they could eat as much as they want. So they were encouraged to take more food than they needed to bring home. And so for 21 days, they had a truly low-fat diet. And here's what happened. These are the foods they ate, okay? They lost plenty of fruit. So it was a native Hawaiian diet, right? So poi, taro, sweet potatoes, all kinds of fruits. That's what they were eating. Plenty of greens, plenty of non-starchy vegetables. And they had a very small amount of animal products. It was 5 to 7 ounces of chicken or fish per day. Completely controlled. All the food was provided for them. In 21 days, the average weight loss was 17 pounds. Blood pressure dropped, cholesterol dropped, and the fasting blood glucose came down as well. And this is with a reduction in medication. So that initial fasting blood glucose average of 162, that would have been higher if they weren't taking their medications. So the 123 is a big drop, especially considering medications were reduced. It's a big deal. And they actually ate more food. So by mass, by weight, they ate more food and less calories. So calorie density is a fundamental principle here. And this is a typical classic study displaying how that works. So their average daily energy intake during the program was 41% less than intake before the program. And this was true even with moderate to high levels of satiety reported by the participants. So even though their calories dropped significantly because they were having whole foods that contain a lot of water, contain a lot of fiber, and are very nutrient dense, they were satisfied with less calories, and that bulk was keeping them full. Water plus fiber equals bulk, and that is the most important metric to be looking at for making sure that you are satisfied between meals and can stick with the program. In 2017, Dr. Nicholas Wright published a randomized controlled trial. He had 65 participants, and to become a participant of the study, you had to have one of the following. You had to be obese, overweight, living with type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, or high cholesterol. And in the intervention group here, it was an ad libitum plant-based diet, 7 to 15% of calories coming from fat. And these are the foods they could eat. So it was very much influenced by Dr. John McDougall and a lot of his work. So beans, starches, plenty of pastas, whole grain pastas. They were taught how to do this. This was a free living situation. These foods were not provided for them like they were in Dr. Shintani's work. They were taught how to eat this food, and they had to do it on their own. And in just 6 months, the control diet, they lost 6 pounds on average, and the low-fat diet lost 26 pounds. And the control diet, there was actually an increase in medications, right? Their health got worse. Whereas on the intervention diet here, 29% decrease in overall medications. Nobody reversed their diabetes on the control diet. In this group, 2 out of 7. In the intervention group, the low-fat, whole food, plant-based program, 29% of participants reversed diabetes, got off their meds, had a healthy A1C. there was 0% reduced medications. Of the people that were still using medications, there was 100% reduction. There was 100% reduction. Everybody reduced their medications in one way or another. And the A1C is fascinating here. So the A1C in the control diet actually went up. It went from non-diabetic to pre-diabetic, 5.7. Whereas in the intervention group, it went from pre-diabetes to no diabetes, 6% to 5.5. Those are some pretty profound results right there. And they found that there was an increased quality of life, better self-efficacy with nutrition, and higher self-esteem. There was no significant change in the enjoyment of food or cost of food in the intervention group. So it wasn't a bunch of sacrifice. It's a huge thing we're really passionate about sharing, and in the work we do at Mastering Diabetes is making sure people understand and are taught a way to do this. It does not feel like a sacrifice. It's actually really enjoyable and delicious and colorful, as you can see on the screen. These are the types of foods that people eat when they're following a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet. And in our program, we are very generous and supportive of eating large quantities of whole fruit. You'll see that a lot in the work we do in these pictures. And so we've established a very simple system for understanding which foods to eat to maximize insulin sensitivity. That is really the work that we do at Mastering Diabetes that Cyrus and I wrote about in our book. It's for everybody who wants to optimize their health, okay? And the specific population we work with, these are people who have a chronic disease, like you sort of dug yourself into a hole and you want to get out of it. And this level of optimization is how we can do that, okay? And it's very powerful and it's very simple. The green light foods, these are foods that you can eat ad libitum, like we saw in the Nicholas Wright broad study, like we saw in Terry Shintani's work with his Hawaiian diet, okay? Ad libitum, eat as much of these foods as you want. They are self-limiting. It is possible to eat too much, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Most people can truly eat in a genuine abundance and not have to worry about how much of these foods they are consuming, okay? There's the first category here is fruits. Whole fruits, everything in this category is whole. So that's gonna be bananas, mangoes, peaches, pears, all right? And there's a lot of fun exotic fruits like kaimito and rollinia and star apple and custard apple and yellow custard apple. It really gets fun. I live in Miami area and I get to eat a lot of these amazing fruits, and it's one of my passions to help people really get to experience the different varieties that exist. Starchy vegetables, that's going to be potatoes, yams, butternut squash, acorn squash, beans, lentils, and peas. There are so many varieties of beans, different types of lentils. Peas are fantastic. I love having sugar snap peas, one of my favorite things to eat in the entire world. Intact whole grains, that's going to be brown rice. That could be farro. That could be quinoa, okay? Intact whole grains, intact being the key word. So brown rice is better than white rice, right? White rice is not going to be in the green light category. That's processed. Intact whole grains. Leafy greens, things like arugula, lettuce, spinach, all right? These are really important, especially when you're in that transition phase of becoming more insulin sensitive, right? You're increasing your carbohydrate content and you're wanting to avoid spikes that might be happening because you're currently insulin resistant, right? Leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables that are essential in this process. You're going to eat them together. So non-starchy vegetables, that's like bell peppers, zucchini, eggplant, tomatoes. That's what's going to be in that category. Herbs and spices, eat those in abundance. Mushrooms. You could also put sprouts in here. Sprouts would fit into the leafy greens category. These are all whole foods, okay? Now, the yellow light category. These are healthy foods. These are foods that we encouraged you to keep as part of your overall diet. There's a lot of research supporting these foods. What we're saying in this category is, if you're trying to reverse insulin resistance, you've got to be cognizant of how much you're having. These are not foods to eat ad libitum. These are not foods to have large quantities of if you really want insulin to work as efficiently as possible. So that's going to be nuts and seeds. That's going to be avocados. Avocados are a very high fat fruit. They're technically a fruit. Coconut meat, all right? Olives. In this case, we're talking about whole olives, right? Unprocessed. A lot of these foods, they're either unprocessed or they're minimally processed, or they're high in sodium, okay? So olives would be an unprocessed food. Now, soy, you could have tofu, you could have tempeh. Those are a little bit more processed. Edamame is the whole form of soy, right? That's a whole food, unprocessed, but it's still high in its fat content. So even edamame has about 40% of calories coming from fat, okay? That could easily skew your day to put you above that 15%, that magic number we're trying to stay under, okay? Pasta alternatives, right? So this is like brown rice pasta. It's good. It's still great, still encouraged, still have it as part of your life, but it's just not the same as brown rice. It's a little more processed. Sprouted bread, so Ezekiel bread would be great here. Again, whatever that bread was originally made of, that's going to be in the green light category. That's going to be a little bit better. Dried fruit, you've removed the water content, which is a huge part of bulk and satiety and helping people not consume excess calories, especially for those who are trying to drop weight. That's a yellow light food. And we have fermented food in this category simply because of the high sodium content. So a lot of the people we work with and help have high cholesterol, high blood pressure. We're really looking to be cognizant of sodium content. So that's why it's a yellow light food. Red light foods, these are the categories of food that we suggest you either just completely avoid or decide to minimize. Consume these in small quantities. Red and white meat, eggs, dairy products, fish and shellfish, oils of any kind. Doesn't matter if it's olive oil or avocado oil. These are highly processed foods that are high in their caloric content. So on the scale of calorie density, these are going to be the most calorie dense foods on the planet, which is not optimal for trying to lose weight and maximize insulin sensitivity. You're better off having some olives and some coconut meat than coconut oil or olive oil, right? The water content's been removed. The fiber's been removed. The carbohydrate has been removed. The protein's been removed. You have pure fat with a little bit of nutrients left over. Go for the whole olives. Refined sweeteners. We want people to sweeten their foods with using dates. It's a great way as a sweetener. We're not fans of any refined sweeteners. A lot of coconut products out there these days. These are just processed foods. Again, like a lot of, plant-based burgers or a lot of, recreations of foods that people have eaten in the past. They're, can now find them in boxes in the grocery stores, and they say plant-based, they say vegan, and all this stuff. But when you look at the ingredients, you look at the fat content, these are not foods that we are recommending for truly maximizing your insulin sensitivity. Okay, so I told you guys how much I love fruit and how we are so fruit friendly, fruit forward at Mastering Diabetes. Cyrus and I just both personally eat a lot of fruit, and we come from that camp and learning of Doug Graham, and there's just a lot of great science around fruit, and we love bringing that to the forefront. So I've decided to share some fruits that are in the USDA nutrient database. So this is a project I did while I was in college. I went through the database and looked for all the whole foods. I was like, I'm just going to make the master list of whole foods, aka green light foods, that I think that people should be eating. Right? Let's just have a complete list to understand like how much of these foods exist. So I did that, and we created a long article about it. It's listed in the book as well. So we have all these foods listed for the different categories: fruits, beans, lentils, starchy vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, and all that. But I'm just going to share fruit just for fun today. And I do want to remind you that this is just what's in the USDA nutrient database. There's a heck of a lot more. And not only are there just fruits that just flat out aren't listed here, but even in any fruit that's listed, there's a bunch of varieties. So mamey sapote, there's magana, there's Key West, there's several others, right? Plantains, when it comes to like plantains, it's basically another form of banana. But there's like over 100 varieties. Persimmons, at least 5 or 6 different varieties that you can get pretty easily throughout the year. The 2 common ones are the hachia and the fuyu. So these are delicious fruits. And as I go through this list, you're going to see they're listed in order of calorie density. So under the words mamey sapote, it says 563 calories per pound. And the magic number of calories per pound, I mean, calories per bite that you can eat in essentially the green light unlimited category is roughly like 600, 650. Okay. Somewhere around there, you're going to be able to just eat these foods. They're going to be self-limiting. And you got to understand, so calories per pound, calorie density, that's a constant. It doesn't matter how much of any given food you're consuming. The calorie density is the calorie density of that food, like per bite. And when you want to lose weight and optimize insulin sensitivity, focusing on foods that are in a sweet spot of calorie density is important, because if the calorie density is too low, then you're just not going to be satisfied. If all you ate was a bunch of lettuce all day, then you wouldn't be satisfied. So the key here is when we share which foods to eat, the fruits at the highest part of this list are the ones that are going to keep you satisfied. If you eat the ones at the bottom, they're not going to fill you up. So mamey is a great food. Plantains are one of our favorite foods. They're available year-round. They're inexpensive, and you can prepare them in a lot of different ways. You could steam them, you could bake them, you can eat them raw. And persimmons are also quite calorie dense. Okay, so let's just go through this list for fun. Jackfruit, actually, juicy fruit gum mimic their flavor after jackfruit. That's where they got the flavor from. So it's called juicy fruit. So jackfruit is just an amazing, amazing flavor. Sugar apple is fantastic. We all know about bananas, pomegranate. Sapodilla tastes like a pear baked in brown sugar with cinnamon on top. Incredible tropical fruit. Cranberries, cherimoya, figs, grapes. We're going to go through this pretty quickly here. Lychees, what a treat those are. Such a short season, but boy, they're beautiful. Cherries, oranges, soursop is a fun one. Kiwi, longans, mangoes, many different varieties of pears. There's a couple that will appear on this list. Apples, raspberries, pineapples, apricots. So these are like stone fruits, right? Apricots, plums, stone fruits are the ones that have like that stone in the middle. A loquat would also be a stone fruit. A cherry is a stone fruit. Nectarines would be a stone fruit. Horned melon, blackberries, mulberries, papayas, grapefruit, Asian pears, prickly pears. There's so many varieties of peaches. Like, it is crazy how many varieties of peaches. I lived in Santa Monica, California for over 10 years, and I got to eat a lot of amazing produce in SoCal. And peaches is growing in abundance in California. Strawberries, star fruit, watermelons, cassava melons. So just a lot of variety. But let's just, before we move on, look at the watermelon, 136 calories per pound. Remember, the mamey was above 500. So if you had the same weight, the same volume of watermelon versus the same watermelon so it's the same weight of mamey, like a 4 times difference, 3 to 4 times difference in total calories you're consuming. And you're not going to be as satisfied if you have too much of a focus on the lower calorie dense fruits. It's an important note to make. So this is Sana. She was a client of ours. And when she came to us, she had been diagnosed with stage 3 kidney disease and also living with type 1 diabetes. So she came to us on a low carb diet, consuming 25 grams of carbohydrate per day. And she followed our program and went all the way up to 200. Okay. It's a very small woman. She's now having 200 calories of carbohydrate per 200 grams of carbohydrate per day. And her insulin use got cut in half. Like, just think about the magnitude difference right there. 25 grams of carbohydrate, 22 units of insulin, right? Then she goes to 200 grams, down to 11 units of total insulin per day. That's a dramatic change in insulin sensitivity. She reversed her stage 3 kidney disease. Her albumin creatine ratio got back into a healthy range. So did her urine protein. Her cholesterol got back into a healthy range. And same thing with her blood pressure. So by focusing on insulin sensitivity, by reversing insulin resistance, she took back control of her type 1 diabetes. Kidney disease is gone. Cholesterol is back in the normal range, and her high blood pressure has been resolved. That's the power of becoming insulin sensitive. Now, I want to address a very confusing topic, which is that a lot of times you will see articles or even research studies saying we compared a low-carb diet to a low-fat diet, and the results were better, more optimal on the low-carb diet, whether that was a better reduction in A1C, a better improvement in time in range. This happens quite frequently, and I want to address this. So I'm going to go over a particular article, and I show you these graphs, not for you to understand the graphs, but to just know that the person who wrote this article did excellent journalism. Like, this is excellent research, this is excellent writing, this is very thorough, and it's well done. And they concluded their article by saying, it is time to retire the fad. Keep in mind that all of these studies are randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of science. All are published in respected, peer-reviewed medical journals. These studies are scientific evidence, as good as it gets, that low carb is much more effective than the low-fat diet that is still being recommended all over the world. It's time to retire the low-fat fad. Okay? Here's the problem. The problem is none of the studies, not a single one of the 23 studies is actually low in fat. So the comparison they were doing of their low carb to a low fat diet, they weren't actually looking at low fat diets. That is the problem. So in that beginning, when I told you maximum 15% of calories from fat, that's a truly low fat diet. And that's where you see the magic happen when it comes to insulin sensitivity. Being in the middle, not so good. So the lowest fat diet of this research article that was written, a journalistic article, it was on Healthline, was 17.8. But then a majority were above 30, above 30% of calories from fat. That's double what we're talking about here. And that's double what the true low-fat research was looking at. Okay? So I would love to share with you guys a little more about time in range. This is a very important topic. It's new, it's emerging. I'm sure a lot of you have seen people wearing these continuous glucose monitors, whether it's a Dexcom or a Freestyle. There's many popular companies who are bringing this device to people who don't have diabetes. So it's becoming part of the, regular conversation in the world of health and wellness. So let's talk about what it is. What is time in range? It's the percentage of time that a person spends with their blood glucose levels in a target range. So you can adjust that range. For people living with type 1 diabetes, the range is 70 to 180. Okay, that's the goal. This has been established by a group of professionals looking at the research and looking at trends in people with diabetes. And that is a healthy goal for somebody who doesn't have a pancreas that is working, okay? So the goal is to stay within that range for 70% of time, right? So whether you're looking at it over the course of 7 days or 30 days or 90 days, the goal is to be above 70%. That's the key here. They have a really strong suggestion to reduce lows, right? So this 4% here, below target, you want to be less than or equal to 4%, okay? So the goal is stay between 70 and 180 as much as possible. Avoid lows. Lows are dangerous, right? Hypoglycemia you can pass out, and that can cause all kinds of problems, right? So being a little high is a little safer. And so the guideline is, let's minimize that as well, but really try and avoid those lows. So there's research of different forms of managing type 1 diabetes, right? So I'm living with type 1. And in a New England Journal of Medicine 2019 paper, people who were using a closed loop system On average, they were at 71%. So I'm going to show you some of my numbers today. I'm on a closed loop system. Right? I use an Omnipod and a Dexcom G6. They communicate that that's a closed loop system. In the past, I have used MDI, and you can see here with the Beck et al. Article, JAMA 2017, 51% of people, people with type 1 diabetes in that study, 51% stayed within the range of 70 to 180, right? So just over half. And in the Lancet paper in 2016, that was 66% of people staying in range. So that's what happened. Now, this is my Dexcom. I took a screenshot of this this morning, and you can see the green, 90% in range. So well above that recommendation of 70. And if you take 125 divided by 37, you want that number to be greater than 3 to demonstrate that your blood glucose variability is in a healthy range. You're not going super high and then it's going super crashing down. So I'm well above 3, and the GMI number is never accurate for me. It's 6.3% is always wrong, right? A1C, I think like 2 weeks ago was 5.5%. So excellent blood glucose control following the mastering diabetes method here. Now for type 2 diabetes, the goal is 100% in range, right? If you're living with type 2 diabetes, your pancreas is still producing insulin. You follow a healthy protocol, like you should be 100% between 70 and 180. And this is an example of somebody who went through our program, Heather. She dropped her A1C from 9.2 to 5.2% following the mastering diabetes method. And you can see she's eating large meals, a very abundant green light foods here. She loves lifting weights. And when she came to us, she was using Zigduo and Trulicity, okay? So those are 2 powerful diabetes meds, and her A1C was still 9.2%. She got off the meds and got it to 5.2, and it's just feeling great. And you can see on the screen here, this was an example, a 9-day window of her average blood glucose readings, and she's consistently staying between 80 and 120, right? So that the thick black line that goes across, that's like, it has very small waves. So people who are concerned, oh man, like I'm going to have these roller coaster mountain type experiences. It's not the case. When this is done properly, you're following the mastering diabetes method, you can have extremely steady blood glucose readings in a low fat environment. That's the key here. This approach that we're talking about has been demonstrated by the longest lived populations all around the world. So all the green dots that on the screen here, they come from 2 amazing books, Healthy at 100 by John Robbins and The Blue Zones by Dan Buettner. And these are people who are known to have lived long, healthy lives, right? Low chronic diseases in these populations. And the key thing they have in common is that they all embraced whole carbohydrate-rich foods. There were some maybe different foods in different areas. Okinawa, Japan was this purple sweet potato. You know, many of the others were highly focused on beans, and they all embraced, you know, whole fruit when the season allowed, and they had dried fruit. So they had carbs, right? None of these groups of people were afraid of eating carbohydrate-rich foods. None of them were following a keto diet or a low-carb diet. They embraced carbohydrate-rich foods. Not every single one of them was following a less than 15% of calories from fat diet. That's not the case. But they were all embracing carbs as the predominant macronutrient ratio. And what I'm saying here today is that we know in 2024, with all the science that we have now, I can share with the science, I can share with the thousands of people who've been through our program, I can see it in my own body every day, that when you keep that fat low, you maximize your insulin sensitivity. So how do you do it? You do it with low-fat, plant-based whole food nutrition. That's how you reverse insulin resistance. That's how you make insulin work as efficiently as possible. That's how you reverse prediabetes. That's how you reverse type 2 diabetes. And as we saw in this presentation, that's how you can reverse kidney disease and lower your cholesterol and lose weight, a laundry list of conditions, okay? So let's see here. This is a funny picture. I hear this. This is me in 2008 eating some mangoes in Costa Rica. It's crazy how many people are scared of fruit, scared of the sugars in fruit. Fruit is not the same as table sugar, right? Fruit comes in a package with fiber and vitamins and minerals and antioxidants and phytochemicals. It's this complex matrix. And the way your body processes it is truthfully beyond our comprehension. You know, there's so much about human biology that we just don't understand. We've learned a lot. We've discovered a tremendous amount. Boy, the complexity of what happens inside your trillions of cells when you eat that whole mango is something we don't understand, and maybe we will never understand. So this is our book here. Cyrus and I wrote Mastering Diabetes, published that in 2020. And we help a lot of people through our coaching program and through our education. And we'll open it up now to some Q&A. And I'll see if there's anything in the chat box that I need to look at. But
okay, so how you doing? Thank you so much, Robby, for all the information that you shared. How would people get in touch with you? They give you a website?
Yes, so the best place to get in touch with us would be through masteringdiabetes.org. That's the easy way to find us. We're on all the social media platforms. We have a podcast, so you could go to Apple or Spotify, type in Mastering Diabetes, you'll find us. Instagram, Mastering Diabetes. TikTok, Mastering Diabetes. Facebook, Mastering Diabetes. But yeah, website, masteringdiabetes.org. Google us. You'll hear us on a lot of other podcasts. The book's on Amazon. The book's on Audible. And we'd love to connect with you guys and help you maximize your insulin sensitivity.
Great, thank you. So we're going to begin the Q&A portion now of the presentation. For anyone who would like to ask Robby a question, you can raise your hand in Zoom. In order to do so, we'll put instructions in the chat. We don't take questions directly from the chat, so we just ask that you raise your hand. So give me 1 second here. Okay, so now I know you went over this whole presentation. What would be like the main takeaways? So, so Mastering Diabetes, and in this presentation, you discussed the revolutionary method to reverse insulin resistance. Can you just summarize it in the key components?
Yeah, the key component is you've got to reduce your dietary fat intake from all sources, right? Whether especially so trans fat, saturated fat, those are the biggest problems. But even in avocados and edamame and nuts and seeds, like total fat intake needs to be reduced. Whole carbohydrate intake needs to be increased. And it's basically that simple.
Okay. Well, I like it simple. I think as I'm sure you've probably spoken or listened to a lot of people in the nutrition field, and it becomes extremely complex. You hear all these nuances, and it can become overwhelming to the point of like a paralysis analysis.
Correct.
So
I love that you're saying that. I could not agree more. And that is something we're very passionate about at Mastering Diabetes. I mean, the recipes we have people eat, I mean, it's just stupidly simple, right? Like, and what I personally do, I've been doing for 18 years. I mean, a meal for me is mangoes, lettuce, and tomatoes. I mean, it's just like, it's just that simple. As a matter of fact, I'll be eating that exactly when we're done here today. I think I might even have some scallions in that one, but it just doesn't have to be that complex. It doesn't take a lot of time. You don't have to have a million ingredients. It can be very, very simple.
Great, thank you so much. And how do you address skepticism regarding the efficacy of a high fruit diet in managing diabetes, given traditional advice often warning against high carbohydrate intake?
So number one is we would encourage people to look at the research, right? So this is what I just covered in this presentation, to really understand how low-fat diets are helpful in optimizing insulin sensitivity. Then you could take a look and be like, okay, well, how much fat is there in fruit? And on average, the fruits are quite low in their fat content, maybe like 6 to 9% if you exclude things like avocado. So fruits are naturally low in their fat content. And then they have a laundry list of other benefits, which is we know that fiber helps slow down the absorption of glucose at a healthy rate. So whole fruits contains a lot of fiber. We know that the water content of whole fruit is very beneficial for satiety, and also just flat out the best water you can consume. Water in whole foods is nature's filtering. right? There's no more pure water than the water that you consume in whole foods, right? Even if you're like baking a sweet potato or something, there's still a lot of water in that final product. Same thing with when you make, like brown rice pasta and stuff like that. It's actually absorbing the water, which is great. But back to the fruit. So we teach that, number one, you got to understand that it's low in fat. You understand that it's a whole food. And then number three, you get to experiment. We really encourage that people put this to the test in their own body. And once you have that experience, it's very powerful and you will never forget it. You're like, wait a minute, hold on a second. All I've read in my entire life about diabetes was be careful about how much fruit I have. And then I just tried the Mastering Diabetes program. I picked up the book. I followed the recipes for the 21-day meal plan in there. And I'm like, and wow, like when I actually do eat fruit in a low-fat environment, my blood glucose levels come down. My diabetes medication needs come down. And that's how I would address anybody who's like skeptical, but open-minded enough to try and solve the problem.
So to that point, there's obviously the idea that humans are herbivores, and then does your research suggest that we're fruitarians, that we're just meant to really eat fruit as our primary?
No, we don't go into that research. I can't say I've even read that research personally. So we believe that, whole plant foods is what we should be consuming and a variety that you enjoy. Some people might not even want to eat that much fruit. Okay, great. And that means you got to focus on the other calorie dense green light foods. So the way those green light foods are listed is in with the first 4 categories being the most calorie dense. So if you're not going to eat very much fruit, you're going to have to get calories from either starchy vegetables, beans, or intact whole grains. The first 4 categories have to be emphasized because the biggest mistake that people make when adopting a low-fat plant-based whole food diet is not eating enough calories. They start eating a lot of salad. They have this big salad that fills them up for like an hour, and then they're starving 2 hours later, 3 hours later. And they're like, oh, like I'm not getting enough protein. This diet isn't working. They go have a cheeseburger and all of a sudden they feel great again because they finally got the calories they needed. So you've got to focus on the green light foods that have substance.
So does this protocol work on everyone in your experience? And to the extent that it doesn't, what types of tweaks should people consider making?
Well, I would say that everybody's nuanced. And in 2024, there's plenty of complex health challenges out there. So to say that it's going to work for like flat out everybody, that would be an overstatement. But will it work for the overall majority of people? I would say yes. I mean, you're especially depending on where you're coming from, right? If you look at our population today, our diet is so far off from what is even like a basic healthy diet. And you think of all the different spokes of healthy living, that diet is where we have lost it the most, right? People still sleep, right? In general, people usually get some sleep. They probably should get more, but they get enough. They sleep. People move a little bit. They walk. They do some exercise. People drink water. People have, some love and community and connection in their life. Like in general, like these spokes people are sort of touching on. But my goodness, when it comes to diet, like we are so far away. So when you start changing towards this approach, I mean, you're going to get way more water, fiber, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and you're likely going to see benefits.
And how does the Mastering Diabetes method cater to children, adolescents with diabetes, especially in terms of dietary recommendations and lifestyle changes?
Yeah, so Brenda Davis is an amazing expert. She wrote a book called Nourish. I forget who she wrote that with recently. And so I wouldn't say that I'm personally like an expert on children's health, right? We would lean on other experts, but from what I've gathered, it ends up being, quite similar. There are obviously some nuanced requirements for children you got to pay attention to. But in general, it's whole plant foods that it's being focused on for children's health. And we do have a rise in childhood obesity and childhood rates of type 2 diabetes, which is really sad to see these days. And I'm confident, if somebody's like curious, like, oh, I got to figure out what to do for children's health, I highly recommend that book, Nourish.
And what challenges have you faced in promoting a high carbohydrate diet in a medical community that often advocates for carbohydrate restriction in diabetes management?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge we've come across is just working, we work with individuals. So we have a coaching practice, and our focus is to help each and every individual that comes along our path and serve them in a way that fits their needs and their unique life and where they live. So for us, the biggest challenge is that transition of people gathering our information, deciding, okay, I want to give this a try, I'm going to implement it, and seeing very high readings in the beginning, right? Especially if they're doing it on their own, they're not like in our coaching program, and they're missing some of the key nuances. Some people just get discouraged. They're just like, oh, this doesn't work for me. I'm different, or something's wrong here. I'm eating this mastering diabetes recipe, and my blood glucose is just going through the roof. And that's because that situation, that person is still very insulin resistant. You don't reverse insulin resistance overnight. It takes time. And how long that's going to take is dependent on each individual and the level of work and commitment that they're putting into this. But yeah, that's the biggest challenge. And we help people like how to overcome it is to focus on a couple key things. So if somebody's thinking like, oh, I'm going to eat these more high carbohydrate rich foods and I'm seeing spikes and I want to see that go away, in the beginning, focusing on some key aspects. Number one, you've got to include greens and non-starchy vegetables with each one of these meals, right? So right at that point, when you're just starting out and you're quite insulin resistant and you're trying to eat more carbohydrate-rich foods, it's not going to be recommended to just sit down and eat like 10 bananas, okay? It's not going to be recommended to sit down and just have a potato, just have a bowl of oatmeal, right? We're going to pair the whole carbohydrate-rich foods with greens and non-starchy vegetables. To this day, 18 days later, I still eat greens at pretty much every meal. That's definitely helpful for type 1 diabetes, which is the nuanced details are a little different than type 2. But greens and non-starchy vegetables at every meal. Then we're going to eat slowly, okay? If you're insulin resistant, even adjusting your pace of eating by slowing down for maybe adding 2 minutes to the meal, 5 minutes to the meal, 10 minutes to the meal can have a very big impact on your blood glucose excursion when you're insulin resistant. So we got greens, non-starchy vegetables, we have eating slower, and then moving your body. Moving your body any time of day is great, right? So you want to be doing something significant every 24 hours. That's ideal. But if you're going to walk, if you're going to have like some of this extra little movement that's not really like intense exercise, if you're living with diabetes, living with insulin resistance, the ideal time would be after the meal. If you have to do it before, that's great. That works, that counts, fantastic. But if you can, when you finish your meal, if you can get up, even if you're just doing the dishes, even if you're just, crushing a bunch of those Amazon boxes that you have at your house, right? You're doing some activity that is going to help stabilize your blood glucose during the transition phase. You don't have to be as diligent and as nuanced about that as you become more and more insulin sensitive. These habits are always helpful, but much more important in the beginning phase.
And what are your thoughts on intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating as a strategy for managing diabetes?
So we're big fans of that. In our book, the Mastering Diabetes Method is broken down into 4 different components. The first component is low-fat, plant-based whole food nutrition. The second component is intermittent fasting. The third one is daily movement. And the fourth one is decision trees. So intermittent fasting is something we teach our clients how to do if they want to. It's not required. You don't have to do that to get results. But it's definitely a very powerful tool. And there's different ways to do it, whether you want to do a 24-hour fast once a week, you want to do a 24-hour fast 2 times a week, you want to do 16-8, 7 days a week, where there's 16 hours of no eating, 8 hours you eat all your meals. These are completely viable options for intermittent fasting. And a lot of people love it, right? So some people are surprised at how much they enjoy not having to think about food the whole day. They can sort of tighten that window. Some people just are shocked at like, wow, the whole day of just not having to deal with food or think about it or worry about it is kind of like a blessing. So and some people just don't enjoy it, right? And it just doesn't really work for them. So that's okay. And that's where our personalized coaching approach comes in.
Thank you. Next question is coming from the audience. Stephen V, please state where you're from and ask your question.
Buffalo, New York. I don't have diabetes. My fasting glucose is around 85, but I did get my fasting insulin measured, and it was around 9.5. Do you guys ever measure the fasting insulin, and do you have a take on that?
So we do have some clients that test it. We don't really require that to be a part of our program. And so a 9 is okay. If I was in your shoes, I would just do an experiment. I would just try and do some optimization and just see what happens in like 90 days. If you can actually get it a little lower. I'd probably see like a 5, 6, 7, somewhere like that might be a little bit better.
Yeah,
but
I eat walnuts and avocado, so I could tighten it up and do an
Yeah.
experiment. I could for sure do that.
I would just for fun, right? It's a 3-month experiment, and I would
Yeah.
also increase your activity, particularly trying to increase weightlifting, strength training. That can be really impactful for insulin sensitivity and just getting some very hungry tissues.
Okay, I do a lot of cardio, but I don't do much weightlifting, so I could do that. Yeah.
And weightlifting is really powerful for long-term health, for bone health, and it's just a great habit for all of us to get into.
Okay, thank you.
For sure.
Thank you. And I don't know if you're comfortable speaking to this, but you went over the different types of diabetes. And what are your thoughts, or is there any growing literature on what actually causes someone to get type 1 diabetes?
There is a lot of research, but nothing is really like conclusive. There's a lot of speculation, but at this point in 2024, I'm just going to say we just don't know. We really just don't know.
And is there any hope for being able to produce insulin once you are type 1, or there's never been a case of anyone reversing from that?
Yeah, so I love this topic. I appreciate the question. I mean, this whole mission of reversing type 1 diabetes is something I've put a lot of time and effort towards for 18 years now. And so the goal, the mission is to reverse type 1 diabetes naturally. There's 2 problems going on. Number one, I have diabetes antibodies, right, that are damaging beta cells. So even if my body started producing new beta cells, our current understanding is that the antibodies would just destroy them anyways, right? So the antibodies are a problem. And then the ability to produce new beta cells inside the pancreas is also another problem. Like, we don't really know how capable we are of doing that naturally. It's kind of difficult. Some cells are harder to replicate than others. So that's the 2 things that need to happen. So I would need to, reproduce my own beta cells inside my body and make sure they're not destroyed by antibodies. And the proof that I successfully did this would be getting blood work showing my C-peptide has increased. So C-peptide is a molecule that's produced in a 1-to-1 ratio with insulin. And then they break off, C-peptide floats around, insulin does its work, and C-peptide is pretty easy to test. It's a very inexpensive test, and it's easy to just figure out how much that you have. So my C-peptide is in an undetectable number. Like, it's less than 0.01. Like, they cannot detect that there's any C-peptide. So it's just like, this dude's not producing any insulin. So that's problem number one. And then I was positive for the antibodies that I did get tested. It was one antibody that was positive. I believe it was IAA. I can't remember exactly, but so to solve diabetes naturally, we need to demonstrate that, okay, you produced new beta cells, and then you went and got a C-peptide, and your C-peptide was in a healthy normal range, right? I would like for it to be around 2. That would be fantastic for me. That'd be a dream come true. And then I could eat all the food I wanted, and not need to inject insulin because I was producing my own. So to this day, that has not happened, right? That we don't have somebody who's done that or any repeatable solution of multiple people doing it. There is no like, I can't wait for the person to write that famous New York Times bestselling book of how to reverse type 1 diabetes, right? Like that's got to exist, but it doesn't exist. So, what is happening is there's a lot of companies doing great research on basically sort of implanting beta cells, right? Or even in some people, just replacing the pancreas, just a complete pancreas transplant. And the problem with these modern solutions is that they're required to use immunosuppressant drugs. Otherwise, the body would just reject the new organ or reject the beta cells that have come from the outside. And unfortunately, the immunosuppressants are worse than type 1 diabetes itself. And some people have, unfortunately died because of the immunosuppressant drugs. So that's kind of like where we're at. There's a lot of other nuanced things happening. I mean, I just visited the Diabetes Research Institute at the University of Miami, and one of the researchers successfully has beta cells injected into the eye of a mouse, and then the beta cells produce and start functioning from the eye. Like, it's amazing. He showed me with his microscope the beta cells literally replicating and functioning like in the retina. Like, it was unbelievable. But the problem is you still need to use immunosuppressant drugs. So there's all kinds of advancements, but for me, mission number one is to figure out what things do I have to do as far as a healthy living mindset, supplements, who knows, to basically reduce the antibodies. That's step one, right? Because then if you don't have anything destroying, then you can start focusing. Then you go, okay, well, now let's make some new beta cells. Two-pronged issue here, but that's what I got to say on that topic.
Great, thank you. Our next question is going to come from Beth S. Beth, please state where you're from and ask your question.
Hi, I'm from Tulsa, and we were happy that you were here. Marathon Day was a high energy day in Tulsa. My question is, if a person is really skinny and they're doing low fat whole plants and they have a giant bowl of fruit or like 9 bananas for breakfast, and 2 hours later they're crashing, like sugar crash, shaky, everything like that, is that just because they're starving, or could that be insulin resistance?
Well, I guess it would be curious to see. It could be a number of things happening. I'd be curious to see, like, are they going very high, right? Was there like a spike to like 200, 250 or something, and then a shoot down? A CGM would basically give us that data. And, just eating only 9 bananas, I mean, maybe that person could consider including greens or non-starchy vegetables or mixing other fruits in there potentially. There'd be a lot of things to play around with, but it's hard to say for sure.
Okay, well, I heard you earlier mentioning the greens, so I figured that's a great place to start.
No question, 100%.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And next question is coming from Janet M. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
Yes. Hi, Robbie. I am from Maryland, and I was just wondering, where do things like coconut water and the coconut water, without any added sugar, and also like freshly made vegetable and fruit juices, and also smoothies, like where does all that fit into your program? Are those green, yellow, or red light foods? I'm just wondering.
Okay, I love that question. I'm actually going to see if I can find the section of the book. I'm going to read this to you because we had a whole section on beverages. Let's see.
What page is that on?
Yeah, we're going to find out right now.
Okay.
I'm looking in the index thinking of what word. Coconut water doesn't appear to be in here. What if we look up coffee? Let's see. Let's see. Let's try 1/6 down. Let's try 227. 227. Let's see. Is that going to be beverages? Well, 227, we talk about caffeine. And then 229, we talk about smoothies. But I'll just answer your question. So fruit juices are going to go into the yellow light category, right? It's not green. You've removed the fiber. It's not red because it's not a terrible option, but it's not ideal either. And we shouldn't just be drinking ad libitum fruit juices, but it's still a good option. So it's yellow light, right? Or fresh squeezed orange juice at home. Let's say you have a juicer and you throw in, who knows, like people juice sweet potatoes these days and they take some carrots and some apples and some celery and lettuce and they make a juice. All kinds of juices out there. Yellow. Coconut water, also yellow, because consuming liquid calories isn't necessarily ideal. But again, the yellow light category is where you play around and personalize. I personally drink about 96 ounces of fresh coconut water every day. I live in Miami. I just love it. It's like my preferred beverage. I'd rather drink coconut water than just regular water, which is what I essentially do. It's great. So, but I'm not trying to lose weight. I'm training for Ironmans. Like it just fits my lifestyle. It's no problem. I'm not drinking it super fast. It's not causing blood glucose spikes or anything like that. So that's the coconut water. And smoothies. Okay. The thing about smoothies also go into the yellow light category. It's not red and it's not ideal because you've broken up the fiber. So imagine you have a block of ice, like a gigantic block of ice the size of your car sitting on your front lawn in your house, okay? And it's a hot day. You live in Miami. It's the summer. It's 90 degrees out, okay? It's still going to take a while for that big block of ice to melt and go into your yard, right? And melt into the soil and all that, okay? Now, imagine you took a blender, a blade, and you just started making shards. Like you just like broke this thing up into a ton of little pieces. And these little pieces go everywhere. Those little pieces are going to melt into the grass very fast. Okay. That's what's happening when you're blending up the fruit. You're increasing the surface area and you're going to be absorbing the glucose faster, right? You've altered the matrix, the whole food matrix, and you will absorb the glucose faster. So the best way to consume a smoothie is a smoothie bowl with greens and eating it with a spoon. That's the best. You could put it in like a glass mason jar. And even in that case, if you ate it with a spoon, that'd be better. But if you made it thicker, so you consumed it slowly, that would be ideal. But just making a really thin, smoothie and just like gulping it quick, it's not going to be ideal. And it's going to fit in the yellow light category. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Cool. All right.
Great. Thank you. And speaking about things going into your bloodstream quickly, one of the popular ways that people like to think of whether food is good for you is the glycemic index and how quickly it goes into our system in the form of glucose. How concerned should we be about the glycemic index of any particular food, or should we be concerned at all as long as it's a green light food? We don't really care about the glycemic index of it.
Okay, so I would love to find that section as well. The answer, there we go. Here we go. 220. We're going to read this together. This is a fun one. I love this topic. Okay, 220 in the book. understanding the glycemic index and glycemic load. All right, a little story time here, Stephen. A little story time. All right. Oh, Michael, sorry, I talked to Stephen already.
No
Sorry.
worries. No worries.
Okay. The glycemic index measures how quickly a food raises your blood glucose levels. The food with the highest GI is pure glucose at 100. Foods can be listed as low glycemic, 55 or less, medium glycemic, 56 to 69, or high glycemic, 70 to 100. The glycemic index of a given food varies by the temperature at which it is eaten, the cooking method, the ripeness, and the variety. For example, sweet potato versus a white potato. The GI is moderately useful because green light foods that are particularly low on the GI, leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, and legumes, will help prevent blood glucose spikes and result in a steadier blood glucose profile throughout the day. Eating significant quantities of a higher GI food, like pineapple, could result in a larger blood glucose spike than would eating a food like blueberries. This is quite helpful during your transition, especially if your baseline level of insulin resistance is high or very high, and is useful if you inject bolus insulin and want to adjust your insulin dosing strategy accordingly. Despite its utility in these specific situations, the GI can also be misleading because it does not factor in the nutrient density of a given food. For example, a Snickers bar has a GI of 43 and peanut butter has a GI of 33, both of which are low. But as you now know, both will increase your level of baseline insulin resistance and result in elevated post-meal blood glucose the next time you attempt to eat carbohydrate-rich foods. Even though all green light foods fall in the low or medium category, the only exception is watermelon with a GI of 72. Only exception, let's just land on that note real quick, folks. All green light foods fall in the low or medium category of the GI. And the one that's outside is at 72 when the scale is 70 to 100. Okay? Green light foods are automatic. Like this, we're going to get to the conclusion. And I'm going to reiterate the conclusion. Okay. We suggest disregarding the glycemic index. The glycemic index does not take into account the quantity or type of macronutrients in your food, the presence of other foods in the same meal, the nutrient density of your food, the status of your gut microbiome, or your level of insulin sensitivity. For these reasons, the glycemic index is not very useful. Okay, now there's a whole nother section about glycemic load, which I could read if you want me to. But the point is the glycemic index is not something worth putting a bunch of focus on. Focus on the green light foods, focus on moving your body, focus on eating at a relatively good pace, and enjoy the foods you love. And follow our recipes because we already have figured out exactly how many greens and non-starchy vegetables you should have in your meals. So you don't have to like overthink, like, am I having enough?
Perfect. I appreciate that. And it was nice in your book there. So when someone's transitioning, what should they be concerned with when they're going from the standard American diet, according to, I believe you cover this in Mastering Diabetes. What are the first things that they should do? And I appreciate your focus on making things easy. So what are the easiest things that that people can start with right away? And how concerned should they be in doing it immediately versus doing it sustainably?
Yeah, so the easy way to start is just change your breakfast. Just change one meal at a time and eat foods you love and don't stress. Like, you're going to be adjusting your entire microbiome. You're going to be eating a lot more fiber than you've ever had when you start following the Mastering Diabetes method. And over 90% of people in the US don't even meet the basic requirements of fiber. So your gut's going to have some adjustments when you're switching from standard American to whole food plant-based. And just go slowly. I mean, that is the best advice. Unless there's some specific health concern going on, then being slow and patient is the better way to actually make these habits last and stick for the long term.
And what are the most important dietary changes someone can make as they're starting or as they're attempting to reverse their insulin? Is it reducing the high fat stuff? Is it increasing the, the fruits and the green light foods? And I realize you'd probably suggest doing both of them simultaneously.
Yeah, for sure.
But what elements are the most important and the most impactful?
It's definitely both simultaneously, but the most important place to start is to start getting rid of trans fat and saturated fat, right? So plant fats are much better, much better. There's an ample amount of research demonstrating that when you replace, start eating avocado instead of having bacon, that type of change is going to be great for your insulin sensitivity. But then there is another level to unlock, and that other level is, okay, well, instead of having a bunch of avocado, I'm going to get more of my calories from bananas and quinoa and potatoes and stuff like that. So the first step is eliminate the worst fats, trans fats and saturated fats. And that's going to be, the animal products and the highly processed foods.
Thank you. Next question is coming from JW. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So I am from Boston, Massachusetts. I have my hemoglobin A1C is 5.1, fasting insulin 2.6. I've never been diabetic, but I have unbelievable cravings for sugar, especially candy. And someone has suggested that I take L-glutamate as a way to get rid of those cravings. What do you think about that?
I can't speak to the L-glutamate suggestion, but I'm curious, do you eat a lot of fruit?
I probably don't eat enough. I always have an apple, I have a pear, I have a banana in a smoothie, but that's probably it.
I mean, if I was in your situation, I would try whole fruit and some fun, fruit-based desserts or fruit-based snacks or meals to see if that is helpful. That's would be spot number one for me.
Okay, because it's interesting. I took the L-glutamate, it made me hungrier. So I'm like, that doesn't work.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, but
Thank you.
Google, as you know, there are so many different niches out there, for all these diets, and there's a niche inside a niche inside a niche. And if you want to, you can start Googling fruit-based recipes. There's a whole world of people who are very passionate about their, raw vegan diet or whatever. But then there's things the fruit-based raw vegan, whatever.
Well, the challenge I have in Boston is we don't really have access to very good fruits.
Okay, so here's the deal.
At Whole Foods.
I'm so glad you asked this question. I'm so glad you did, because this is a topic I'm quite passionate about. Okay. Anybody who lives in a major city most likely can get some really good fruit if you take the time to go and start. So you got to look for your ethnic markets. You got to be going to the Mexican markets in town, the Chinese markets. It's these small little weird stores. It's not like the major grocery store. It's not Whole Foods. That's not where you're going to find the exotic fun things.
Yeah, because there's nothing at Whole Foods. I mean, there's mangoes.
Yeah. There's great things there. There's a lot of good things there. But and I also will say, when you start going down this rabbit hole of all these fun, low-fat fruit-based desserts, that's what you should Google. And also, as a side note, you can ask ChatGPT to give you recipes. You're like, hey, I want a low-fat fruit-based chocolate cake recipe or something, and ChatGPT will come up with it. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Okay. Wow. But anyways, also things like carob powder, or if you're okay with caffeine, you want to have some cacao, things like that that you can just order on Amazon, some of these flavor agents that you can order on Amazon could add a lot of flavor to a sugar craving type of situation. But also summer's approaching, right? And so in Boston, you're going to have some good farmers market experiences. There's no question. I can't say I've been to markets there, but you should be able to get some really fun fruit in the summer.
Okay. All right. And you speak for other groups? Because I'd love to have you speak for our group. So
yeah, absolutely. Okay. You can reach out to our team. It's team@masteringdiabetes.org.
Okay, super. Thank you very much, Robby.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, JW. So how does Mastering Diabetes approach, how does that align with or differ from the dietary guidelines from major diabetes organizations such as the American Diabetic Association?
So, I mean, the major difference from our perspective is we don't put a cap on whole carbohydrate consumption, right? So, like when I said that ratio, minimum 70%. So if you go up to 75, you go 80, 85, up to 90 if you really wanted to. Whole foods would, like, if you just ate fruits and greens, it'll be like 95.5. It could work. I mean, it might not be ideal for everybody, but you could potentially meet all your nutrition requirements in that situation. But the main thing is majority of the organizations are putting a cap on carbohydrate intake. And I would say that's the biggest thing for diabetes, right? We're helping people also really optimize their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, right? So that's a big focus. Although I think that the truth is, when you look at dietary recommendations, almost any of them for some of these major organizations, they usually, like, they aren't that bad. If people actually followed these general recommendations, they would be far better off than what's going on in our population right now. So I don't really want to take any position of like, oh, like they have like the worst recommendations ever. It's not really the case. Like it's usually pretty sound, pretty solid. People just don't follow them. There's always, I obviously think there's room for improvement, but the biggest difference is the carbohydrate consumption.
Thank you. So we had a participant ask about L-glutamate. Now, what about supplements? Is that something that people should be concerned about? Is any sort of supplementation?
So we recommend people definitely work with their doctor on any nutrition deficiencies that they may be concerned with, that they currently have. So we do recommend B12 as a supplement for sure. And then when it comes to your omega-3 fatty acid status, we recommend you get tested. You can do a test through Omega Quant, see where you're at, and then with your medical professional, decide, is that something that we want to supplement with, or are we going to make lifestyle changes and see if we can optimize it ourselves? Is it already in a good place? The biggest problem people have there is they're just consuming too many omega-6 fats, and it's inhibiting their ability to do the conversion of the alpha linoleic acid that they're consuming. So that's a big area of concern. And, any other area, it's really individualized. We don't really have any like array of supplements. You should have all these different supplements. Everybody needs them. That's not our position. It should be very personalized. It should be intentional. It should be driven by some objective reasoning to do that. We'd rather people spend their time and money on high quality food and making meals that are delicious versus just taking supplements for the sake of taking supplements.
How does your program support individuals with prediabetes so they can avoid going to type 2 diabetes?
The best thing, I mean, prediabetes is a blessing in disguise. If you can catch your diabetes at that point and are here listening to this and have this information, like, what a blessing, because you can turn things around quickly, and now's the time to do it. You are still producing plenty of insulin. If you continue to let things progress and insulin resistance to develop, you may lose your insulin production, right? Prediabetes means your pancreas is working extra hard to keep up, and it's currently not keeping up anymore. It was keeping up. It was working hard before you hit prediabetes, and your A1C was fine, and your fasting blood glucose was fine. But you gotten to the next level. It's working extra hard and it can't keep up. And if it keeps on working harder and harder, the pancreas can burn out. So we really made that distinction in our book about the difference between insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes and non-insulin-dependent type 2. You don't want to get to that point of insulin-dependent type 2. So our program is really helpful in helping people address the root cause right now versus just trying to go and eat low carb and still be insulin resistant and still be, basically furthering insulin resistance by having high fat, high protein meals. We're doing the exact opposite. We're getting low protein, low fat, reversing insulin resistance, and getting prediabetes out of your life.
Does cooked or raw matter? with regard to diabetes?
So we have a principle within our coaching program that one of our coaches, Kylie Buckner, created, and she called it ARAP, as raw as possible. And it helps people who are coming in super insulin resistant, who are looking to see some fast results, start normalizing blood glucose levels. We have found that eating more raw foods in your meals does help. It does help. That's not like a long-term strategy you have to implement. We're not telling people you should be like you should go to be 100% raw. If you wanted to, you could, but it's not necessarily a key tenet of what we're doing. But we do see that, especially when you're insulin resistant, there is benefit to eating more raw foods.
And what are the most common misconceptions about diabetes you encounter, and how does your book aim to overcome those misconceptions?
Yeah, the number one misconception is that you should avoid carbs, and that, and even within that world, the second one would be that all carbs are created equal, that the sugar in fruit is the same as the sugar in a pastry, or the sugars in, the baked potato you're consuming is the same as the sugars in, a cupcake. And it's just not the case, right? So those are two gigantic misconceptions around the world of diabetes and blood sugar. And I would say another big misconception is that insulin resistance is like that. Basically, eating a bunch of carbs is going to make you insulin resistant. Like you're gonna have elevated insulin levels because you ate the carbohydrates. It kind of ties back to the first point, but that's not the case. That's not what's happening. It's like the elevated insulin levels are a consequence of the high fat, high processed foods you were consuming prior. And that is a gigantic misconception. And I understand why people are confused, because they have a blood glucose meter and they can test themselves and they see that, wow, I ate the banana and my blood sugar went high. Like, how could it not be the banana? So I get why people are confused, but the banana is just the innocent bystander in the situation.
Great. So we've got a minute left. Real quickly, can you just speak on stress and how stress impacts blood sugar? Is that something we should be concerned about?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say, in my experience coaching people and having thousands of people run through our program with our team of coaches, we have an amazing team of coaches, just so you all know: registered dietitians, certified diabetes care and education specialists, registered nurses, health coaches, weight loss experts. Like, it's incredible. But in our experience, stress leads to poor lifestyle choices, right? If you were super stressed and you somehow manage that decently well and stuck to a really healthy program, your blood glucose levels are probably going to be just fine. Your stress is definitely, it's a little bit of an issue, but I think it can be sort of overstated. It's stress in and of itself. It's more of what stress leads to, in my opinion. And so stress relief habits and managing stress better, to me, is more about how that's going to impact your decisions throughout the day and the weeks of an stressful event than it is about just what's happening metabolically inside your body.
So it sounds like it operates almost like a linchpin habit, where if you don't take care of your stress, your other healthy behaviors may falter.
Correct. 100%.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Robby, for the information that you shared with us today. If we could unmute the audience so they could share their appreciation for Robby, please.
Thank you.
Thank you,
That was
Robby.
wonderful.
Thank you, Robby. Thank you, Robby.
Enjoyed it so much.
Thank you.